Okay, so Meighan, do me a favor, just give a little bit about your background and about your focus, and especially how that relates to displaced populations nowadays.
Sure. So my name is Meighan Stone, and I'm currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a foreign policy bipartisan think tank in New York and Washington, D.C. But previous to that, I was president at the Malala Fund, so I worked with Malala Yousafzai, the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize winner, in building her foundation, and we had a really strong focus on education for refugees. But what I would say was most important in my bio is actually when I was 5 years old, my family hosted a Cambodian refugee in our home here in the United States, and I think that's probably why I do the work that I do, and I think that changed my life forever. So to me, that's much more important than credentials, but that's my background.
That's great. Meighan, talk a little bit about your work in Mercy Corps, and especially your focus as it relates to learning.
Yeah, so I'm a technology for development advisor with Mercy Corps, which is an international NGO working in humanitarian and development work in 42 countries around the world. So I advise our youth team on how to involve digital platforms in their activities that relate to education, learning, learn to earn, employability. So basically any type of platform that they would want to implement, I help them determine how to do it safely and inclusively to make sure that we're reaching vulnerable populations as well.
So again, our time is just far too short here, but what I want to do first is, what I have found is I've talked to brilliant people that are focused on a number of these issues, like my guests here, is that many of the preconceptions that I had about displaced populations are just completely wrong. So maybe, Meighan, you can help us just to, we don't want to numb people with statistics, but maybe just to get a sense of what's we talk about in terms of the problem domain. How many people are there, and what is their what are the range of situations that they're in?
Yeah, I always like to start by asking, is there anyone in the room that this is part of their family story, being a refugee, being displaced, part of your history? I see a couple hands, so I just want to honor those experiences and just bring that into the room, because it's so much more common than people realize, and it's always astonishing to me to meet people and to hear their story of where they've come from. You know, today there's 68.5 million refugees worldwide. It's the most we've had since World War II. I think what's really important to think about when you look at that huge number is that over half of all refugees are children, so we're talking about 18 and under. And then when we think about education and go a step further, less than 2% of all emergency aid is spent on education. So we're looking at people that are often displaced for 17 years. So we're looking at the entire educational career of a child. They can live displaced, either in a camp or in an urban resettlement situation or going from country to country. And this is something that technology, our sector, really needs to get our arms around. Right now, it's not. So we need innovation, we need funding, we need focus, we need better policy, and we need everyone in this room to come alongside with us and look at this, because this is actually normal. I think we think that displacement is abnormal. It has always been part of human history, and so we need to innovate and iterate in how we handle it and stop being surprised when it comes up over and over again. We need to find more sustainable solutions.
Well, and especially two of my epiphanies from listening to people like Meighan and Meghann is the first is that our picture in many cases of people in camps, there are many displaced people that are in cities and are simply barred from working. That for whatever reason, the laws of the country, the limited access to work, it means that they're in a foreign country. They might have a tremendous skill set from where they came from. They might have been trained as a doctor or a teacher, and they're not allowed to work, or they don't have access to work. So that's the first one. And the second is that when I talk about the future of work, I talk a lot about that basically at the end of the day, as humans, we're just problem solvers. That's what we do. We solve problems. When you're talking about displaced populations, you're talking about problems that have chosen them. So they have problems that they need to solve in the work that they do, but in addition, by the situations that they're in, they have all these additional challenges that keep them from being able to learn what they need to be able to ultimately have productive lives. So talk a little bit about not just Mercy Corps, but Net Hope and the sort of the context for how we can think of a range of different organizations coming together and trying to focus on some of these core issues.
So Mercy Corps is a part of a consortium called Net Hope, which is a group of both private and nonprofit organizations and several other actors that collaborates on multiple different activities. So Wi-Fi and connectivity is a huge one, and we're also starting to look at, again, How do we get people educated? How do we get people employed? How do they learn how to work in a digital space? And so we're really trying to collaborate with NetHope specifically to solve some of those big challenges. Just a couple of interesting facts to think about is that this year, 3.6 billion people were using messaging apps around the world. 191 million of those were in Africa. And a good portion of that is youth. And so that is an excellent way to reach people. And so we're working with NetHope to think about creative pathways and collaborations with governments in the local areas so that we're creating contextually specific and accurate programs that are getting people onto online platforms.
So what are some of we have a magic wand and we can start to put in place some of the solutions that we think might be able to help some of the populations. First off, what are we trying to help with, or what are we trying to empower them to do? Because I think if we think of this simply as a poor population that needs our help, then we failed. That's basically what I think Western economies have done over and over again. But what are some of the things we can be thinking about in terms of the types of tools and capabilities that we need to co-create with people who are in these situations?
Yeah. I mean, I think one space is we need to change how the humanitarian sector works with the tech sector. I don't know if anyone here has ever tried to work with the UN or the World Bank or the IMF. Was it painful? It's like
I still have the scars.
Yeah, I mean, in these jobs, I would become really close to the ladies in procurement. I would go down with my donuts and chocolate and remember their birthdays. And, I'd be like, hey, it's me. I'm coming up to talk about a crazy test project again. And they're like, are they in our system? Is the vendor in our system? I'm like, no, they're not. It's trying to find ways to take this kind of dinosaur structure and get it into a space where we can try to do more rapid testing, piloting. So I think there's real work that has to be done within the humanitarian sector. We are not serving these populations with the best. What I love about, people know about Partners in Health. They used to fight to get AIDS treatment affordable, and they would go to these global meetings, and they were total pains in the ass. Everyone was like, shut up, stop, this is impossible, stop saying the AIDS treatment is going to be affordable, it's impossible. And they had this whole guiding principle of a preferential option for the poor, which is actually liberation theology, right, from South America. They weren't Catholic, they just loved this idea. And they kept fighting for that. And they're like, why is it when it comes to the poor or people in need, we give them the worst? We're like, you get the broken tech, you get the last solution, we're gonna get someone to donate something that may or may not fit what your community needs, we won't talk to you about what you actually need, we'll just put it on you and say thank you. We need to change this, and I think there's no reason a community like this can't come together and say, why aren't we bringing the best technology to solve these problems? This community absolutely can be served and deserves that, I think. So I think the whole sector needs to change, and people say they want to, and they have great talking points, and like sometimes they go to tech conferences like this, and they're very cool for a minute, and then they go back to the HQ and they don't change anything. So I think the humanitarian sector has got to come to the modern era. I mean, does that happen to you? I feel like so many times these projects, it's like, oh, it's the kooky kids with the pet project, and you're like, what? No, like this is about finding disruptive change to serve 68.5 million people. Like huge opportunity, huge opportunity.
Exactly, yeah, definitely pain points that I'm very familiar with. One of the biggest challenges that we run into is that in the humanitarian sector, we're running on grants, and those are usually short term, so maybe 1 to 3 years max, very rarely beyond 5. And a lot of these programs and projects require a significant investment for an extended period of time to figure out which platforms work, time to test them and then go back and fix them. So a 5 to 10 year investment, and that just doesn't exist in this industry. Additionally, as you mentioned, procurement is a huge issue. So if every single country team has to go through procurement, a lengthy procurement process to engage with a tech partner, that again slows down implementation, it slows down our ability to prove the impact, because by the time they get the actual procurement process completed, the program is 6 months over and you don't have the user base to pull from. So we're really working at the HQ level to figure out how can we redesign these programs at a global level so that when we identify a very interesting pilot that we really want to invest in, we can speed up procurement policies. We can create master service agreements that are global so that when a Niger, for example, reaches out to us, we can provide them with a partner that's already in our system. So we're really trying as much as we can to smooth those barriers on our side, but I think it's going to take an industry-wide approach and also from the donor side as well.
So coming from the Silicon Valley realm, I can tell you that what's typically happens is we bring really smart people who really know how to build technological solutions to this kind of process, and they hear these kinds of barriers and challenges and just think, well, why can't you just route around the problem? I mean, this just sounds like, just procurement, and why can't we just, we're disruptors, let's just go disrupt this. Well, the truth is, these are actual barriers that you encounter. We often do not deeply understand the problems of the people in country. We just sort of make it up. We just sort of guess what we think it's going to be, and we replicate the mistakes of the development community in the past. And so yet, when we, especially when we're talking about learning, where I want to make sure we keep coming back to, we have tremendous opportunity to leverage a bunch of these technologies that we're talking about just in our earlier session, and yet they're not widely distributed, they're not widely accessible, and even just raw connectivity is one of the biggest underpinning challenges.
I think there's a huge opportunity for people in this room to find ways to connect with the humanitarian sector. And as you're building your businesses and your companies and your tech, I would encourage all of you, just planting a seed, to think about use cases for humanitarian response. So, that's everything from logistics to healthcare to employment to connectivity. I think there's a space where instead of waiting, I think the way the sector works now, how we engage often with the Valley is once you've become a billionaire, your company's huge, then make a donation. It's like philanthropically be engaged. I think we would have much better success solving some of these problems if we could say to founders and people who are creating businesses in new technology, think about a use case. We're not saying it's going to be your primary business, but is there some space where actually this could really solve a huge logistical problem? I used to be at the World Food Program, which is part of the UN. It's a UN agency. We fed 80 million people a year. 80 million people, food. Moving food means planes, trains, automobiles. We set up the communications cluster, the logistics cluster on behalf of the entire UN system and all humanitarian responders. So if you ever see a disaster, say there's a tsunami or there's an earthquake or there's conflict and it takes out the entire telecoms backbone, we are the ones that go in and reestablish it. Reset up airports, reset up just basics to communicate and start moving resources in really tight timelines. There's huge spaces where better tech could help that. Another big challenge is actually identification as well. About 1.1 billion people in the world have no way to prove their identity. And so people have been trying to think about what is self-sovereign identity. How could people, even in the US, when we had families coming to the border and getting separated, how could they show up and have their own identity built out, in advance through all kinds of tech, blockchain, other ways, but to prove who they are, so that they can then put their kids in school, get a job, get a bank account, do the basics, of getting plugged back into hopefully restarting a life.
So again, sort of anchoring in education. So you've talked about digital identity. So that's actually something that could help somebody who, once they've started to learn, actually can have that information captured someplace. And if they go some other place, they're suddenly displaced again, that can still follow them. What are some of the other challenges that we need to be thinking about that these populations especially need help with?
Yeah, so I think they're pretty basic ones. Power is one. So if we give people devices and platforms to learn on and they can't power their devices safely and equitably, they can't access those. Connectivity similarly. So if there's not cell service or mobile data available, or it's very slow and people can't utilize online platforms, that's a problem. So any platforms developed have to work on and offline. We also need to think about the gender divide. So just basic education right now, there's a huge gap between how many girls and how many boys are in traditional educational models. And that's because of social norms, it's because of safety issues, and the list goes on. And the divide is the same with tech. So oftentimes one cell phone will be held by a family, and that's owned by the man. And so a young girl won't have access to an online education platform necessarily. We estimate that around 250 million fewer women than men have access to phones. So these are a few huge barriers. We also want to be thinking about the practicality. So if we're looking at displaced populations and they're on the move, is it safe to give children tablets and phones? So those are all considerations that we really want to take into account when we're thinking about how to safely provide these platforms for education.
I think on education too, in all humanitarian work or aid work or international development, it's follow the money, follow the money, and you can look and see how it's spent and what's prioritized. And there's a huge gap in secondary education. So there's a big focus on primary, and then girls especially, like you were sharing, about 39 million girls live in countries where they're impacted by conflict in some way. Or war, and huge number of girls who are not being reached, or we're just losing them after the age of 12. And that's another place where we need to change. We need to change the focus to secondary education, increase funding, resources, attention. And right now it's not there. People are pushing for it, but it hasn't gotten to the space it needs. So we're challenged because kids are getting through primary and then don't have a way to continue. And the secondary education years, isn't that when we all kind of figured out, hopefully began to kind of know who we were, right? What we were good at, what we thought we might want to do in the world. So when we're losing kids at age 12, we're losing them at the most critical time for them to hopefully progress and achieve their potential. And so we need to have more resources and attention there.
So if you've got any questions for Meighan or Meghann, please walk up to the microphone. I've got another question for you. So you've talked about learn to earn. So just help us understand what that is and what's different about learning that is calibrated around trying to anchor it in future work.
Yeah, so Mercy Corps really focuses on learn to earn and making sure that people have access to the hard and soft skills that are required in their context to be a successful entrepreneur or business person. And so learn to earn is identifying those skills and then providing a space for people to learn them and to practice them. So that could be anywhere from writing a CV and understanding what needs to go on your CV to understanding what are the types of jobs that are available in your economy. What should you be training for and learning to do, so that we're not applying sort of a traditional model in a place where a traditional model won't work. One of the areas that I'm really planning to explore with our youth team this year is looking at how to get people active on the digital economy. So if you have people who are isolated or unable to work in the locations that they're in because of legal reasons, because they are not legally in the country, for any particular reason, how do we get them safely interacting in a digital economy?
So we've talked about some of the problems now, some of the solution approaches. So do you think, obviously a lot of talk here about blockchain and instantiated credentials and that sort of thing. Is that the kind of place that we should be urging people to focus their efforts, is to leverage those kinds of technologies? Or what are some of there's some mundane things that we need to be providing, like solar panels, or right? What are the technologies we know most need to be focusing on to be able to enable access to learning for these?
Yeah. I feel like the humanitarian sector can learn from this community in terms of how this community builds businesses and how people invest in this community and the tech and the businesses that you're building, the companies you're building. Like if you're in VC, you take a bunch of bets, and a bunch of them are not going to work out, and you're hoping you get that unicorn. But it's a space that our sector doesn't embrace. The whole incentivization doesn't facilitate just trying, I don't want to say moonshot because it's so hackneyed, but it's true. It's like trying something that seems a little crazy. It's like, how is this ever going to be affordable or scalable? Well, we know the tech becomes more affordable over time. I think getting back to this idea of like preferential option for the poor, the gap right now in connectivity, the gap in learning, the gap in just what you're learning. It's in so many of these countries, kids are fleeing a rote education system that's memorization based, and that's the whole education system. They are only going to get left further and further behind if that's the same kind of education we're delivering to them. I think we have an opportunity with whatever we create. It's like, what would it truly mean to educate a child who, say, is in Turkey now, who fled Syria? Right now we have, actually, as of yesterday, there are more Venezuelan refugees, actually, than there were Syrian refugees, for those that are tracking what's happening right now with that crisis. But, for any of these kids who are displaced, like, what would it mean to give them a great education, like a modern education? The purpose of education is, of course, to find ourselves, to learn, to be better global citizens, but it's also to work. It's to work. And I believe the pathway to agency is through work and achieving potential and not constantly re-perpetuating a system of handouts. We need to give these kids the same quality education we would insist on for our own children. I don't send my son to a substandard school. I fight for him to get a great education, and we should want and fight for the same quality of technology, the same quality of education. So I think you have to be willing to make some big bets and do some creative thinking.
Well, and I think that works at all levels, right? So at the grassroots level, one of the things Hlala didn't get a chance to talk about is that actually she is taking the work that she's done, and she's designed, incidentally, the system that she's got to work both online and offline. So it's actually downloads a whole bunch of stuff, and then it can be completely offline. And they are translating it into a dozen different languages. They've been invited into countries all around the world, and that is really low-cost technology that can, basically be provided at the grassroots level. And then I think there's more of the, you were talking about moonshots, there's more of, what NetHope is trying to do, which is essentially to knit together a bunch of these different organizations and then to do the kind of outreach to Silicon Valley and the Singularity community, and to try to find ways to be able to collaborate to be able to solve some of these challenges at scale. So certainly anybody who's interested in learning more should approach Meighan after the session. So your question, please.
Hi, thank you. So in Latin America particularly, we have a lot of trade schools, and the challenge that I want to ask to you is, how do you keep these people from, yes, okay, I'm going to get into the digital economy, I'm going to learn a trade, but how do I turn that into a lifelong learning and get out of the mindset of, I'm going to learn this trade, and this set of skills I learned in 6 months, a year is going to be useful for me for the next 10, 20 years, or basically like my whole lifetime?
Any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different pieces to that, right? So the first is understanding the context that the people are in, and really making sure that when we start to design a training program, whether it's hard skills or soft skills, we have done our homework and we know what's going to be most helpful for them in that area. And thinking into the future, so what will they need in a year? What will they need in 2 to 5 years when they have a family that they're trying to support? And how will their career path need to change? And then another piece is also thinking about those skills to invest in that are going to be applicable across almost any type of career. So soft skills, interpersonal skills, communication skills, knowledge of basic tools. Again, those tools would be specific to the context and the type of training that you're going to do. But doing a landscape analysis as well of that, in that particular area. What intercultural or cultural aspects do you need to be familiar with and sensitive to when you're designing a program for those areas as well? And then they can take those skills into any new career that they choose to follow.
I mean, I would say that we need to change how we invest in these programs. Right now, the way that our sector works is a lot of the money goes to, international organizations or, frankly, mostly global north, Western-based organizations. And I think we need to change how we invest our resources and actually invest in people in country who are building their own institutions, their own platforms, their own communities of learning. Like I think about a friend of ours, Roya Mahbub from the Digital Citizen Foundation in Afghanistan. Her passion project right now, in addition to coaching the Afghan girls robotics team, which is just incredible, is trying to start the first girls' high school for coding and tech in Afghanistan, and then add college to that as well. And so now she's in this process. And sometimes people kind of look at her, she lives in Herat when she's in Afghanistan. It's a really challenging place, to do this work. But she's like, I'm from this community, I'm ready to do it. I'm not afraid, I'm gonna do this, partner with me on this. And she's fighting right now to get funding. To me, it's like, she's a great bet. That is somebody I wanna bet on. I wanna bet on Roya, right? But we have to fight to get that money for her where, so much money is lost through inefficiency and spent largely in headquarters, in global north cities instead of in the communities where it ultimately should be dedicated. So I think it gets back to the system has to change. Instead of us sitting in these rooms only thinking, how do we get those folks funded and have them telling us what they need and then investing in them over the long term.
And I would just add one more thing that I think we know from 50 years of work with a book called What Color's Your Parachute, a career manual, that people actually have a decision-making process they go through when they think about their careers and leveraging the skills that they have and the ones that they most want to use. And one of the challenges when you get a time of rapid change, if you were, in the old rules of work, if you were trained in a particular trade and you could reliably be able to do that for the majority of your career, you are that trade. You are that trades person in your head. And in a world of rapid change, we need to help people to encourage a mindset to step back a little bit and instead to think of themselves as a person who has a certain set of skills. And so you talk about soft skills, we typically call them transferable skills, but the basic idea is that you have a set of capabilities, some of which can be used in a range of different areas. The problem is that the trade whether you were taught to be a lumberjack or to repair air conditioners, the trade, that special knowledge in that arena increasingly becomes automated. And so if you keep thinking of yourself as that air conditioner repairman and suddenly every air conditioner repairs itself or calls for new parts to be sent to it, you will no longer be the person who can actually have that identity rooted in that arena. And so that's I think on us to help train people to have that kind of adaptive mindset. And so I'm sorry, on that, we're out of time. Once I apologize once again. It's the tyranny of the schedule. So
Can we hang out after?
But yeah, please. But again, I hope you guys will be available during the break. And please join me in thanking Meighan and Meghann for their perspectives. So thanks a lot, guys.